related to the books we talked about. One question is, when a person realizes or thinks that they may be like out of balance in some way, how can the person approach cultivating balance? So that's one question.
You know, when I was younger, by nature I'm very shy and reserved. In gatherings, Hussein sometimes would tell me, when everybody was dancing, he would say, "Go dance." Of course, he himself would never dance, and his wife would never dance, but since he had the power to push us around, he'd say, "Go dance." And that was in my nature. And he would always, after I would say no, he would always say that you'll really never end up to be anything. I'd say, okay. That was very encouraging. I really liked him. Loved him even. Feared him, respected him. And I think I did 90% of the things that he had told me to do. And primarily, I think, because they went well with my temperament. But dancing was something I couldn't do. It was far too public, far too visible. And when I had all these degrees and I applied for jobs, and you've heard me say this before, you know, it's one thing to sit in your room and just read. It's one thing to sit in your room and write. It's one thing to sit with your friends and talk about things. Because these are all very comfortable environments, and you're familiar with them, and you've been in the habit of just doing these things on a regular basis. There were never any discomfort, many doubts, any uncertainties. You knew the environment really, really well, so you felt comfortable. Dancing was something I couldn't do, so when I applied for jobs and I went to interviews, of course just getting the interview was exciting, but now it was something public. There were 5 or 6 or 7 people sitting and asking me questions. And it wasn't so much dancing with my body, it was now at the interview I had to dance with my intellect, I had to connect ideas well, I had to express myself well. So in some ways I had to sell myself to make sure that they know that I can govern a classroom of 40, 50, 60 people. But because I didn't really have any public practice, you know, even when I used to sing, the lights had to be turned off. And when it came to a point where everybody just got tired of turning off the lights, I had to hide my face behind the deaf. So my facial expression, which was really an extension of the way I was feeling about things, the poems, the way I was singing them, it was far too public, and I didn't want people I didn't know well, even people I knew well, to. It was like being naked. And so, despite my own desire to be okay in public, despite Hussein's encouragement, I could never do it. So if your question is, my nature is A, and whether it's a book or someone out there, my companion or a friend, is telling me that instead of being A all the time, why don't you try being B for some time? It's going to be very, very difficult, if not altogether impossible. And it's normal because the environment is unfamiliar and you have no idea how you're going to react in this unfamiliar environment. Because when an environment is unfamiliar to you and you have to act in it, you become a stranger to yourself. You have no idea how your next move is going to be, how you're going to feel, how you're going to think, how you're going to react, and it's just too much. Add to it the fact that other people are looking at you and you're very conscious of that, and you don't like to be judged like that. It makes you feel weak, incompetent. Unless you live in a setting created by someone like Gurdjieff, or a setting created by someone like Bai Sahib, who to some extent, knows what your temperament and personality are like. And so they will push you in ways that you will be made uncomfortable, and somehow you have to manage. And the thing about Gurdjieff or Bai Sahib or anyone who fits that particular scenario is that because of the relationship you have with them, it's not going to be easy for you to simply say no to them and walk away. It won't work. Because you fear them, you respect them, you love them, you will try to kind of do as they say, despite how uncomfortable it may be, and little by little, gradually, you'll grow a thicker and thicker skin to the point where you can actually do the very things that made you uncomfortable initially. So, what you have then is you have a temperament that's feeling based. The problem with feeling is like being with a companion, and you don't know if your companion is going to stay with you or leave you. That's what feelings do. You wake up and you feel really good, and so you read a book. You have the desire to read the book, but the emotions aren't there. So you have to wait and wait, and you wait for these particular emotions to come by so you can be inspired to read a book. So if the basis of who and what you are is feeling type, and then someone says, why don't you read Idris Shah? learning how to learn, or knowing how to know, or whatever, the book may be that has been penned by him. Here's the thing with Idris Shah. Idris Shah is, if you were to kind of follow the personality types, of Gurdjieff, Idris Shah he's a perfectionist. He's also a 9, which is he's like a guide. He pushes you around. He is also a 5. And he has a wing of 4, which means that to some extent he covers all 9 points, But when you read his writings, it's kind of like how you function at work. You're in hospice. You take care of people who are sick and dying. You have a family member, a wife, a husband, a brother, a sister who's looking at, their child who's dying, and they're consumed by grief, and there are just too many emotions inside them. The idea of them being a stoic, standing outside of this particular event and trying to be objective, for them it's just not going to happen. That's not the way grief functions. But because you have been doing this for a long, long time, you approach this in a very rational, detached way. It doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean you don't feel. It just means that the way you are is helpful to the patient, and also to those people who are going to be left behind. And Idris Shah is very much the same way. I don't know much about him. I've never really read his life story, who he was, what he was, how he was trained, what sort of teachers he had. And that's, in some ways, it's just the way the Middle East works. No one knows anything about you. You just appear from nowhere. And because the culture, to some extent, frowns on anyone who writes a biography, autobiography, who talks about themselves. The culture doesn't allow for that, So all these people, live in this shroud of mystery. I had sent this anthology of Sufi sayings to this publisher, and because it's a very big and known publisher, usually what they do is they select some pages and they send it to various professors. And so I got the comments back, and there were 4 people who had reviewed this book, and two of them had said, this book is no good. He doesn't tell us who these people are, where they come from, how they've been trained. One had even mentioned, well, the book is definitely no good because it doesn't have any African Sufis. And that's one of the difficulties with academicians, not knowing, because they don't live in the culture, they haven't been seasoned by it. They assume that everyone needs to be like Barack Obama. You write a life story and then you publish it so everyone knows, who you are, where you've come from, what you've done. And that's not the way Middle East works. But from the 30, 40, 50 books of Idris Shah, they're all the same. He doesn't show very much emotions. And that's the quality of a really, really good teacher, because, he's not there to just, create emotions inside you so you can have certain feelings. His task is for you to really understand, what the hell is going on, what you need to do to change certain things about yourself. All of his books have just stories, and because he lives in London, sometimes comes to America, because his audience are Westerners, and because meditation, Sufism, Buddhism, these are rather exotic philosophies for Westerners. And because after you have read a book on Buddhism or whatever ism it is that you're interested in, you assume yourself that just because you've read a book and you've felt a few things, you are now ready to be a student. He kind of deconstructs all of that. He just makes you feel really infantile. And in some ways it's really good, in some ways it's not very good. So if, again, your question is, I am basically a person who just feels, I feel myself through life. I don't think myself through life. When you encounter someone like Idris Shah, and there is another thing that I think is important to mention. Idris Shah is from Afghanistan. I don't know if he was born there or he migrated at a young age or he never, lived there. I don't know that, but because Islamic Sufism follows the tradition of Muhammad, and Muhammad was a married man, Muhammad had children, Muhammad was a social and political reformer, he was also a spiritual seeker. And so in the Islamic Sufism, if you really, really want to be a good student, you need to have your physical life in order, and you have to participate in various branches of life. You can't just walk into a cave, it doesn't work that way. It may have worked for him when he was young, but because he had obligations, and that's the way Sufis think about this stuff, at least the authentic ones. So you have Idris Shah, who is a political activist, a social activist, for the benefit of Afghanistan. He's also a married man, he's also a father. So he's occupying all these different branches. And he may have been very emotional when it came to religion, but he couldn't be emotional with his kids, or he couldn't be emotional with his wife, or he couldn't be emotional with Afghanistan. Because to be able to, I think, fix any problem, you really need to be sober intellectually. You can't allow your emotions to guide you. Emotions are important because it's like they open this door. I mean, that's what emotions do, It's like without emotions you can't pray, without emotions you can't cry, without emotions you can't feel helpless, without emotions you can't beg. So emotions are like these initiatory components that you need for something about you to awaken, to inspire, to excite. But once this door is open, you're there to kind of wipe away your tears, get rid of the emotions, and sit back and just watch what's happening, both inwardly and outwardly. To make sure you're not being deceived, not only by your own self, but also with other people who kind of advertise to you various things. And because I think the things you're looking for require a lot of stamina, a lot of patience. Because you have a physical body, and that physical body lives in society, and you have to make rent, and you have to buy food, and you have to make gas, and you have to work. If you want to exist in life, you really have to allow your intellect, seasoned by emotions, but you really, for the most part, have to allow sobriety to govern you. I had this student some years ago. He used to come to class, quite often, and then he moved away, and then he came back, then he moved away, then he came back, and now he's gone to Texas. He got a job, and he didn't even graduate from San Francisco, but nevertheless he got a job, thank God. He left his parents when he was, I think, 14. He's now about 35, 36. And for the past, I think, 20 years or so, he's been surf couching. Is that how you say it? Surf couch? Couch surf? Couch surf? Yeah, couch surfing. And couch surfing is, it's a weird thing. Weird and interesting in the sense that you kind of just walk into some stranger's space. You don't know who they are or what they are. And yet you feel comfortable. And then the person who's allowing you to enter the space, they too feel comfortable. And it's a really, really weird thing. And what happens after a while, when you become accustomed to doing things, you lose the ability to respect anyone's space, because you're just so comfortable. You've grown to be so comfortable with just going here and going there, it's a bad example, but it's kind of like prostitution to some extent. You don't really care who it is. You don't really care how they look. You don't really care what they are on the inside, whether they have any depth or substance, how casual or serious they are, where they come from. As long as they have some money, that's all that matters to you. And you kind of just grow to be callous. And because you're just surfing around, it means your ability to kind of find stability, that kind of gets lost. Your capacity to become dependent on anyone for too long, that also gets lost, because the moment you feel uncomfortable with someone's space, you kind of just go online, see who's offering another couch for you to surf, and you just pack up and leave, And so intellectually, you don't find any grounds. Emotionally, you don't find any grounds. There is no stability. There is no foundation to stand on. You're always moving around. And the problem with a journey such as this, a quest such as this, is that you can't be moving around. It doesn't work that way. The only thing that really grounds you is your ability to understand something inside and out. You need feelings, don't get me wrong. Feelings are really, really important. Even when I listen to Idris Shah, when I read his books, the truth is I kind of feel inadequate in every aspect of my life. I feel incompetent. He makes me doubt myself, He doesn't enjoy anyone going to him saying, I'm a student. He kind of just slaps you left and right. And so whenever I see, him like reading a question, I want to be a student of Sufism. He says such mean things to the people who ask these questions. And then when he talks about teachers, he even becomes meaner. When he talks about communities, I mean, it doesn't really matter where you go in his writings. Everything is so devastatingly difficult the way he puts it, where you kind of lose the ability to trust any of your intentions or motives, you know. And in some ways it's really, really good because it's a weird kind of baptism, you know. I don't know if he had any disciples. I don't know if anyone inherited his community. I know that he has a daughter who writes. She may be dead now. I know he has a son who writes, but they come nowhere close to him. An illustration that these things really can't just be inherited. It doesn't work that way. You know, the other thing that's really, really nice about sobriety of mind, as opposed to it being contaminated by intense emotions, is, you know, if Alexis comes to you and says, your chocolate chip cookies are absolutely amazing, how do I make it? Can you give me the recipe? If you have experimented with just trying to make chocolate chip cookies by just through your taste buds, never taking notes, never paying attention, just going through the feelings, when she comes by and asking for a recipe, well, you can't really give it to her. You just tell her, well, but just, you know, I use some flour, some chocolate chips, and some brown sugar. Just keep trying. And if it tastes good on your taste buds, just enjoy that. And she says, well, yeah, I understand that, but if there's a recipe, it's like there's a science behind it. And as if I follow the steps every time, then the chocolate chip that I enjoyed so much, the ones you gave me, it means that I can make them on my own. Every time I miss or I want chocolate food, I can have them. And so in some ways, what Idris Shah, or someone like Krishnamurti, or someone like the Buddha, or someone who's really good at what they do, is that when you read their works, you realize they're not like the Christian desert fathers, you know, who are just consumed by emotions. Let me also just add that, you know, there are many, many different paths and many, many different ways you can get to the place you want to get to. You know, maybe Idris Shah doesn't work for you. Maybe Irina Tweedy doesn't work for you. I mean, people have, you know, different temperaments. Their intention is different. And what works for you may not work for her. You know? But I think if you want to work with someone like Idris Shah, you have to adopt his culture. You have to think the way he does. You have to feel the way he does. You have to talk the way he does. I mean, that in some sense, you don't have a will of your own. It doesn't work that way, you know. It doesn't mean that you need to be Afghani, or it doesn't mean that you need to be Indian. You need to have the culture that lives inside Idris Shah, have the culture that lives inside Bhai Sahib, you know. You know, parts of him are Indian, sure, Bhai Sahib, but there are many other parts that have to do with his temperament, the way he sees things. So in essence, you have to see the world through his eyes, and you have to speak through his tongue, and you have to feel through his emotions. Which means, for the most part, that you have to kind of, if there are things about, say, yourself that you enjoy, such as I mean, these are just scenarios. I don't mean to. It's not about you or anybody here. If, for example, you like to read Daughter of Fire, and Idris Shah comes to you and says, "Get rid of the book. You need to read my books." You know, that's exactly what Shams did to Rumi. Rumi had 3 books, according to, you know, some of the stories that we have of Rumi. One of the books was an Arab poet, the other was his father's book. And there was another book I don't remember right now. But when Shams meets him, first he gets rid of most of the books. And then one night when he goes into his bedroom, he sees that there are 3 books, you know, next to his bed. And he says, "What are those?" So I read them every day. They're like my Quran. He says, "No, get rid of them." And there's a good reason. The only book that Rumi had to read was Shams. There is no other book to read. It's just Shams. You have to read Shams. You have to read his body language, and you have to read, or by read I mean pay attention to what he says, how he says them. And that's the book that you have to pay attention. You know, that's the book that you have to read. Because what happens, the conflict that exists right now is, there is this thing called philokalia. You know, very intense sort of writings and lifestyle by the Christian Desert Fathers. Very, very, very intense. And that's their tradition. It's kind of like the wailing tradition of the 13th and 14th century, where women just walk around town and they just cry, scream, because they want to inspire some emotions inside them. They want those emotions to come out, and for God to see them, for the public to see them. And that inspires them to weep even more, and beg even more, and pray even more intensely. So that becomes your tradition. You really, really enjoy philokalia because it kind of just connects to your emotional center. You're also curious about Idris Shah. You know, all of a sudden, and I say this for myself, you know, because to some extent I'm kind of not proficient in any of this stuff. So let's say I just like to feel the stuff. I don't know how to think about this, you know, I just want to feel them. Idris Shah all of a sudden comes by, and I read the writing, and I love the way he writes. The difficulty now confronting me is, when I read Idris Shah, I can't get up at 2 in the morning and pray. When I read Idris Shah, when it comes to fasting, I'm not going to fast. You know, because I'm just reflecting and examining and trying to look at this in a very rational, sober way. But I really do want to pray. And you can't serve 2 masters. It doesn't work. I can't follow Idris Shah and I can't follow Baisab, because it doesn't work. You know, now when I read Daughter of Fire, most of the book, it's a great book. I think it's a good book for those who want to begin. But it's a really, really awful book because it doesn't provide you. I mean, it does, but you have to read between the lines. And I think a book such as Daughter of Fire, you need a teacher on the outside to tell you what this process is all about, what's happening, you know. What are the reasons behind Irina's weeping and throwing temper tantrums all the time, and her feelings of love for this man? So I think for us, who are for the most part beginners, you know, becoming contaminated by philokalia or Daughter of Fire, and at the same time learning how to learn and knowing how to know, it's just too much. Because your intellect will begin to sabotage your emotions. In fact, they begin to attack your emotions. You begin to have a very negative self-image, and then your emotions will begin to attack and sabotage your intellect, you know. And I think you have to, I don't know, maybe you just have to go through this for like 15, 20, 30 years until these two, lion and lamb, can lay together harmoniously without one wanting to devour the other. You know, and it may be because he was a very good student of Gurdjieff's without having ever met him. And perhaps he didn't really like the people who had inherited Gurdjieff's school. If he was the product of Gurdjieffian philosophy, the problem with his philosophy is that you never engage in internal consideration. In other words, you never blame other people for the way you feel, which means that you must always exercise detachment. But I think to begin such a quest, you feel intensely. You can't be detached from the emotions. You know, Gurdjieff creates emotions, then pushes you to become detached from emotions, and in some ways it's really, really good.